What if you knew exactly where your body would be found before you disappeared? What if, weeks before vanishing without a trace, you looked into the eyes of the people you love and said, with unsettling certainty, "My body will be found near the mountains"? Would you believe that's possible, or would you dismiss it as a random phrase, perhaps a bad joke, something no one should take seriously? Because that's exactly what happened. An ordinary man, living a seemingly normal life, uttered those specific words. It wasn't a vague assumption, it wasn't a philosophical commentary on mortality. It was a precise, almost surgical statement about fate itself. And the most terrifying thing? He was absolutely right. We're talking about a real case that challenges everything. We think we know about premonitions, about the human mind's ability to access information that hasn't yet happened, about the boundaries between coincidence and destiny. This isn't one of those mysteries where we have to interpret vague signs or connect the dots. No, here we have clear words, witnesses who heard it, and an outcome that corresponds exactly to what was predicted. Now, imagine the scene for a moment. You're talking to someone close to you, maybe during dinner, maybe on any given afternoon, and suddenly this person pauses, looks at you with an expression you can't quite decipher, and says these words, "My body will be found near the mountains." How would you react? You'd probably laugh nervously, change the subject, or ask why on earth they're saying something so morbid. You certainly wouldn't believe it was a real premonition of what was about to happen. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever heard someone say something so specific and disturbing that it stuck in your memory? That was exactly the reaction of the people around him. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody imagined that those words weren't just words, but a map, a tragic roadmap of what was to come. And perhaps that's why this case is so frightening, because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people know. Sometimes there's something happening at levels of consciousness that we don't understand, something that allows us to glimpse our own end. This is not a typical disappearance case. We're not talking about someone who left home one morning and never returned, leaving their family without answers. We're talking about someone who, in a way, gave a warning, who left a clear verbal clue about where to look, but who was ignored because our rational mind simply cannot process this type of information as legitimate. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may completely change how you view premonitions, dreams, and the human mind's ability to transcend linear time. The mountains he mentioned were not a casual reference. There were specific mountains near the region where he lived, vast areas, difficult to traverse, places where one could easily get lost, or where something terrible could happen, far from the eyes of any witness. When he said those words, was he merely expressing fear, or was something deeper happening, a perception beyond normal consciousness, an open window to a future he could not avoid, only foresee? What makes this case even more disturbing is that we're not dealing with an unstable person, someone who constantly made dramatic predictions or sought attention. We're talking about a balanced man who led an ordinary life, who had responsibilities, relationships, routines. And then suddenly this statement, these words that would echo in the minds of everyone who knew him after the impossible, became reality. Have you ever felt that chill, that inexplicable sensation that something is about to happen? Have you ever had such a strong premonition that it seemed like more than just anxiety or imagination? Well, it was something like that, but amplified, that he must have experienced before uttering those prophetic words. And now looking back, with the knowledge of how the story ended, every detail, every moment that preceded the disappearance takes on a completely different weight and meaning. What you're about to discover is a story that will make you question everything. Because when we learn who this man was, when we understand the life he led and the circumstances surrounding that prophetic statement, the mystery deepens in a way that no rational explanation can fully resolve. So take a deep breath, because we're about to delve into one of the most unsettling cases of premonition and disappearance ever documented. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you're feeling that chill, if this story is affecting you the same way it affected me when I discovered this case, leave a comment below. Tell me, do you believe in premonitions? Have you ever had a strong premonition that came true? Or do you know someone who has gone through something similar? These accounts you share are fundamental, because often the most impressive stories are hidden in the experiences of ordinary people, like you. And look, if you're enjoying the content so far, click that like button. It may seem like a simple gesture, but it makes a huge difference. That's what shows the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be seen, that real cases and unexplained mysteries have an audience that isn't afraid to explore the unknown. Each like is a vote of confidence that I'm on the right track, bringing this kind of content to you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time, because every week I bring you real cases that will make you question reality, unexplained disappearances, premonitions that have come true, mysteries that defy logic. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like you, seek to understand the deepest mysteries of human existence. Don't forget to activate the notification bell too, because you won't want to miss any of these cases that I will continue to bring you. Now that you're part of this journey with me, let's find out who the man behind this impossible prophecy was, because understanding who he was makes everything even more disturbing. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he was 34 years old when he disappeared. Thomas was nobody extraordinary in the eyes of the world, and perhaps that's precisely what makes his story so impactful. He was one of those guys you'd meet at the supermarket, at the gym, at the gas station, and you'd never imagine he was carrying the weight of a premonition about his own end. He was just an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, until suddenly he wasn't anymore. Thomas worked as an IT technician at a medium-sized company in Boulder, Colorado. He was the kind of reliable professional, the guy everyone turned to when their computer crashed or there was a problem with the network. His co-workers described him as calm, a man of few words, but always willing to help. He had a somewhat reserved manner, but he wasn't antisocial. He participated in occasional happy hours, talked about sports during breaks, and maintained cordial relationships with everyone. He grew up in Colorado, in a middle-class family. His father was a mechanic, his mother a primary school teacher, and he had a younger sister named Jennifer. Thomas's childhood was absolutely ordinary, without significant traumas, without events that could explain what was to come. He played basketball in high school, got average grades, and had a small but solid circle of friends. After high school, he took a technical course in computer science because he was good with computers and it seemed like a practical way to make a living. Thomas was content with his life. He wasn't ambitious in the traditional sense. He didn't dream of being a CEO or changing the world. He wanted stability, comfort, and free time for his personal passions. And those passions included hiking in the mountains. This is a crucial detail you need to remember because it will make all the difference when we get to the prophetic words he spoke. Thomas loved the mountains. He grew up seeing the peaks of the Rockies on the horizon, and since adolescence he had a habit of hiking on weekends. It wasn't extreme mountaineering, just walks on familiar trails, moments of connection with nature. He knew the region well, could read maps, had the right equipment, and always followed basics, safety rules. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. In terms of relationships, Thomas was single at the time of his disappearance. He had ended a 3-year relationship about 6 months prior, an amicable breakup. His ex-girlfriend, Claire, later said that Thomas was caring but somewhat emotionally closed off. He had difficulty expressing deep feelings, preferring to demonstrate affection through practical actions. But there were no resentments, nothing to suggest any reason for something bad to happen. Thomas's routine was predictably, almost comfortingly so. He woke up at 6:30 every morning, made coffee at home, checked the news, and left for work at 7:40. His workday was from 8 km to 5 km, with an hour for lunch, which he spent reading technology articles. After work, sometimes he went to the gym, sometimes he went straight home. 2 or 3 times a week, he met up with friends, and on weekends, whenever possible, he went to the mountains. This regular routine, this structured life without major upheavals, is what makes what happened so disconcerting. There were no obvious signs of danger in his life. There were no enemies, no debts, no involvement with anything illegal or dangerous. He was just a guy living his life, making his choices, following his path. People who knew Thomas well say he wasn't the mystical or spiritual type. He didn't believe in horoscopes, didn't read about esotericism, and had no interest in paranormal topics. His mindset was practical, based on facts, on things he could see and touch. He trusted science, technology, and logic, which makes it all the more strange that he was the one who had this specific and frighteningly accurate premonition. His sister Jennifer, who was close to him despite living in different cities, says that Thomas was always the protective brother she could trust. He helped her financially through college, was always there for important dates, and kept in regular contact. Jennifer says she never imagined her brother was harboring any dark premonitions because Thomas never mentioned strange dreams or feelings of danger before that specific moment. Thomas's parents, James and Carol Brennan, described their son as balanced, perhaps a little emotionally distant, but fundamentally good and reliable. James was proud of his son's independence. Carol mentions that Thomas would call every week, usually on Sunday evenings, to talk about everyday things. And in none of these conversations did he ever mention fears, premonitions, or anything that could serve as a warning. The impact of this overall normalcy is fundamental to understanding the story, because when an ordinary, balanced, rational person who has never shown interest in premonitions suddenly makes a specific statement about where their body will be found, it forces us to pay attention. It can't be dismissed as the delusion of someone unstable. Thomas was the opposite of that, and perhaps that's exactly why, when he finally spoke those words, they carried a weight that no one recognized at the time. Thomas's life before the premonition was a perfect example of how human existence can seem completely ordinary until something extraordinary breaks through that normality. He wasn't searching for answers about the meaning of life. He wasn't going through an existential crisis. He hadn't undergone any recent radical transformation. He was simply living without imagining that he was approaching a point where his consciousness would grasp a hidden truth about his own future. If you're now realizing how unsettling it is when someone completely ordinary has a premonition, comment below. This could happen to anyone. Because now, we need to understand exactly what Thomas said and in what context those impossible words were spoken. It was a Friday night, September 19th. Thomas was at a local bar called Mountain View, one of those cozy places with rustic decor, live music on weekends, and a regular clientele everyone knows. He was with three close friends: David, his best friend since high school who worked as a civil engineer, Marcus, a co-worker from the IT company, and Ryan, a guy Thomas met through mountain hiking groups. It was an ordinary night, one of those they regularly had with nothing special planned, just beer, small talk, and laughter. The atmosphere was light. They had spent the last hour talking about football, complaining about bosses at work, making jokes about relationships. David had just told a funny story about a disastrous first date and everyone was laughing. It was at that moment, in the midst of this relaxed and completely normal atmosphere, that something changed. Thomas suddenly fell silent. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence initially, just a pause in the conversation. But then David noticed that Thomas was staring into space, with an expression he later described as distant, almost as if he were in a trance. David nudged Thomas on the shoulder and asked if everything was all right. Thomas blinked a few times, as if returning from somewhere far away, and then said in a strangely calm and emotionless voice, "My body will be found near the mountains." That's it. Just like that. Out of nowhere. No context, no introduction, no explanation. Just that sentence hanging in the air like a silent bomb that no one knew how to disarm. The three friends remained silent for a few seconds, processing what they had just heard. Ryan was the first to react with a nervous laugh, saying something like, "Dude, what the hell was that? Are you okay?" Marcus also laughed, thinking it was some kind of weird joke or reference to something he didn't understand. David, who had known Thomas longer, noticed that there was something different about the way he had spoken, but even so he tried to lighten the mood by asking if Thomas had started watching too many horror movies. Thomas didn't laugh. He just looked at his three friends, one by one, with that same distant expression and repeated, "My body will be found near the mountains. I'm telling you now because you need to know." And then, as if a switch had been flipped back on, Thomas returned to normal. He picked up his beer, took a sip, and completely changed the subject. asking if anyone wanted another round of fries. The change was so abrupt, so disconcerting, that the three friends didn't know how to react. They exchanged glances, the kind of look that says, "You heard that too, right?" Without needing words. Marcus tried to steer the conversation back to the topic, asking Thomas what he meant by that, if he was serious, or if it was some inside joke they hadn't understood. But Thomas just shrugged and said he wasn't sure why he'd said that the words just came out. He smiled somewhat forcedly and insisted that everything was fine, that it was probably just tiredness or work stress. Ryan, trying to lighten the mood, joked about Thomas watching too many documentaries, about disappearances, and everyone laughed. But it was that kind of uncomfortable laugh you give when you don't quite know how to handle a strange situation. They continued their evening, drank a few more beers, talked about other things, but those words lingered in the air like a dark cloud that no one wanted to acknowledge. The impact of that moment would only be understood later. At the time, everyone treated it as a momentary eccentricity, perhaps a strange slip of the tongue. Or maybe Thomas was conducting some kind of social experiment to see how they would react. David admitted in later interviews that he was a little worried, that he even asked Thomas in the parking lot as they were leaving if he was thinking about hurting himself or if he was going through some kind of crisis. Thomas assured him that he wasn't, that everything was fine, that he didn't even know why he had said that. In the following days, the three friends discussed the episode amongst themselves. Marcus texted David saying that Thomas had been acting strangely that night, but David replied that it was probably nothing, that everyone has weird moments sometimes. Ryan even forgot about the incident completely until much later, when everything had already happened. That's how the human mind works, right? We discard information that doesn't fit into our normal understanding of how the world works. But here's the most chilling part. Thomas didn't make that statement just once. 3 days. After that Friday at the bar, he was having lunch with his sister, Jennifer, who had come to visit him for the weekend. They were at a casual restaurant talking about life, about their parents, about plans for the holidays. And in the middle of the conversation, Thomas stopped eating, looked at Jennifer with that same distant expression and said, "If something happens to me, my body will be near the mountains." Jennifer was completely bewildered. She asked what on earth he was talking about, if he was having suicidal thoughts, if he needed professional help. Thomas vehemently denied it, saying he wasn't depressed, that he had no plans to hurt himself, that he simply felt he needed to say it. Jennifer was so worried that she called her parents that same night, reporting the strange conversation. Carol, her mother, was alarmed and called Thomas immediately, asking if he was okay, if he needed to talk to someone, if he wanted her to visit him. Thomas reassured his mother, saying everything was fine, that Jennifer had worried unnecessarily, that he had only made a silly comment that had been misinterpreted. Carol suggested he see a psychologist, just to talk, to make sure he was processing the breakup and work stress well. Thomas promised he would consider it, but never made an appointment. What makes these revelations even more disturbing is that there was no outward sign that Thomas was in real danger. His life continued normally. He went to work every day, fulfilled his responsibilities, kept in touch with friends and family. There were no drastic changes in behavior, no emotional farewells, no signs that he was planning something or that he knew something terrible was about to happen, except for these prophetic pronouncements that he would occasionally utter, as if he were channeling information from somewhere beyond normal consciousness. The hidden truth behind those words would only become evident later, when everyone looked back and realized that Thomas was trying to communicate something he didn't even fully understand himself. He wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't joking. Something was happening behind the scenes in his mind, some kind of inexplicable knowledge about his own destiny that was trying to find expression through those seemingly random phrases. If you've ever said something without knowing why you were saying it, something that simply slipped out of your mouth without you consciously processing it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when you start investigating the weeks leading up to Thomas's disappearance, you discover that those prophetic pronouncements weren't isolated events. There was a pattern forming, a series of signs that no one could connect until it was too late. And look, we're not talking about dramatic changes or obviously disturbed behavior. We're talking about small deviations from normality, subtleties that only make sense when you look back. About 3 weeks before his disappearance, Thomas began having trouble sleeping. He casually mentioned it to Marcus at work, saying he was waking up in the middle of the night and having difficulty falling back asleep. Marcus asked if it was stress, and Thomas said he would wake up with a strange feeling of restlessness, as if he had forgotten something important, but couldn't remember what it was. But the sleep problems worsened. David noticed that Thomas had pronounced dark circles under his eyes when they met for coffee. When he asked if everything was all right, Thomas admitted that he had been having strange dreams. They were dreams about being lost in the mountains. They weren't nightmares in the traditional sense, because there were no monsters or obvious dangers. It was more of a feeling, an atmosphere of being alone in a vast place searching for something he never found. Jennifer, Thomas's sister, noticed subtle changes during that weekend visit. She said Thomas was more thoughtful than usual, less present in conversations. He frequently looked out the window as if absorbed in deep thought. When Jennifer asked directly if something was bothering him, Thomas gave that somewhat forced smile and said he was just tired, that perhaps he needed a vacation. But there was something more specific that Jennifer noticed. During that weekend, they went for a hike together on an easy trail. It was an activity they always did when she visited him. But this time, in the middle of the trail, Thomas suddenly stopped and stared at the mountains in the distance. Jennifer waited, thinking he was just enjoying the view, but then she noticed he was trembling slightly. When she touched his arm and asked what was wrong, Thomas said something she would never forget. "I've been here before, not now, but I will be. Do you understand?" Jennifer didn't understand. She thought Thomas was speaking in a confused way, perhaps out of tiredness. She laughed nervously and said that of course he'd been there before. They'd been walking that trail for years. But Thomas shook his head and said, "That's not it. It's different. I can't explain it." And then he simply continued walking, leaving Jennifer confused and worried. Behind the scenes at work, there were also subtle signs. A colleague of Thomas's named Sarah later commented that he had gone to update his beneficiary death documents 2 weeks before the disappearance. What caught Sarah's attention was the way Thomas was acting. He was too calm, almost clinical, while filling out the forms. And when Sarah made a mild comment about it being morbid to think about such things, Thomas looked at her and said, "It's better to be prepared." Ryan, the friend Thomas met through hiking groups, noticed a change in how Thomas was relating to the mountains. They had arranged to do a longer hike about 10 days before his disappearance. During the hike, Ryan noticed that Thomas was photographing specific places with his cell phone, not the typical panoramic views, but strange details. Particular rock formations, isolated trees, natural landmarks that weren't particularly beautiful. When Ryan asked why he was taking these photos, Thomas said he wanted to remember but didn't elaborate. There was also a strange incident at work that Marcus witnessed. Thomas was fixing someone's computer when he suddenly stopped, staring blankly at the screen for several seconds without blinking. Marcus called his name twice before Thomas reacted. When he finally came to, Thomas seemed disoriented, as if he didn't know where he was for a moment. He apologized, saying he'd had a very strong case of déjà vu. Thomas's mother, Carol, called him 3 days before his disappearance. She said the conversation was strange, that Thomas was more emotional than usual. He thanked her for being a good mother, for always believing in him. Carol was surprised by the sudden gratitude and asked if everything was all right. Thomas said he was just going through a phase in his life where he was appreciating the important people in his life more. But Carol sensed something strange in that conversation, a farewell quality to it. David received a text message from Thomas on Thursday night, the day before his disappearance. The message read, "Thanks for being my friend all these years. You were always there when I needed you." David found it strange to receive such a message out of the blue and replied with a joke, asking if Thomas was drunk. Thomas responded with a laughing emoji and said everything was fine. But when David reread that message later, he realized there was a final tone to it. What connects all these incidents is a growing sense that Thomas was preparing for something, even if unconsciously. There was a journey happening inside him that no one could see, a silent transformation where he was processing information that came from somewhere beyond rational logic. These weren't dramatic changes that would immediately make someone think of intervention. They were just subtle deviations from the norm, small cracks through which something inexplicable was leaking. The impact of these signs would only be understood in retrospect. At the time, everyone who witnessed these moments dismissed them as temporary eccentricities, tiredness, or stress. No one connected the dots because they seemed unconnected. But when you put it all together, you realize that Thomas was living under the weight of a terrible knowledge that he could neither fully process nor effectively communicate. If you're now noticing how these small signs formed a pattern that everyone missed, comment below. The signs were there. Because now we need to talk about the day that changed everything. The day Thomas left home for the last time. It was Friday, October 26th. The day began like any other for Thomas Brennan. His alarm clock rang at 6:30 a.m. as usual. Neighbors in the apartment confirmed hearing the shower running around 6:40, following his usual morning routine. Thomas made coffee, put on casual clothes, jeans and a grey t-shirt with the logo of a camping equipment brand, and left the apartment at 7:35 a.m. Security cameras in the building captured him walking down the hallway toward the elevator, carrying a black backpack. But here's the first detail that takes on significance when we look back. It was Friday, a normal workday, but Thomas wasn't dressed in his usual office clothes, and the backpack he was carrying wasn't his work backpack with his laptop. It was his hiking backpack. When investigators checked the apartment afterward, they found his laptop on the living room table, plugged into the charger. Thomas had texted Marcus at 7 in the morning saying he wouldn't be coming to work because he wasn't feeling well and was taking the day off. Marcus replied, wishing him well and telling him to rest. But Thomas didn't stay home resting. Traffic cameras captured him driving his silver Honda Civic toward the mountains at 8:15 a.m. He stopped at a gas station at 8:40, where he filled up his car and bought a bottle of water and a granola bar. The gas station attendant didn't notice anything strange about his behavior, saying Thomas seemed normal, maybe a little quiet but nothing alarming. He paid in cash, took his change and left. At 9:20 a.m. Thomas called his mother. Carol was at work when the phone rang, and she almost didn't answer because she was in the middle of a class, but something made her pick up. Thomas said he just wanted to hear her voice, that he was going hiking and thought he'd call first. Carol thought it was strange that he was calling in the middle of a workday, but Thomas explained that he had taken the day off. They talked for less than 2 minutes, a seemingly normal conversation about nothing in particular. The last thing Thomas said before hanging up was, "I love you, Mom. You know that, right?" Carol replied that yes, she loved him too. And then the call ended. That was Thomas's last confirmed communication with family or friends, but his journey that morning continued. A trail camera, the kind nature photographers and forest service workers use to monitor wildlife, captured Thomas walking along a well-known trail called Bear Creek Trail at 10:05 a.m. In the photo, he is alone, looking ahead with his backpack on his back. His expression is neutral, almost resigned. A hiking couple, Ted and Linda Morrison, crossed paths with Thomas on the trail around 10:30. They remembered him because they greeted each other as is customary among hikers, and Thomas returned the greeting but didn't stop to chat. Ted later said he thought Thomas seemed determined, as if he were on a specific mission, not just doing a recreational hike. Linda noticed he was sweating quite a bit, which was strange because the morning was cold, and the trail in that early section wasn't particularly difficult. And then Thomas simply disappeared. There were no more confirmed sightings of him after that encounter with the Morrison couple. No other camera captured him. No other hiker reported seeing him. It was as if he had simply evaporated into the mountains, leaving only that trail of evidence that ended abruptly at 10:30 in the morning. But when exactly did people realize something was wrong? That's a complicated question. That Friday night, David tried to call Thomas to arrange to watch a game together, but the phone went straight to voicemail. David assumed Thomas was going to bed early because he was sick, as he had told Marcus. Marcus also didn't worry when Thomas didn't answer messages during the day, thinking he was resting. It wasn't until Saturday morning that people started to get worried. Carol tried calling Thomas several times and couldn't get through. She called Jennifer, who also tried and couldn't reach her. Jennifer then called David, asking if he knew where Thomas was. David went to Thomas's apartment around noon on Saturday. He had a spare key that Thomas had given him years ago for emergencies. When he entered the apartment, everything was in order, but Thomas's car wasn't in the garage. It was at that moment that David began to feel that tightness in his stomach, that feeling that something was very wrong. He called the police at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, reporting that a friend had been missing for more than 24 hours. The police initially treated it as a routine case, an adult who probably had his reasons for not answering the phone. But when David mentioned the prophetic statements Thomas had made about his body being found near the mountains, the tone of the conversation changed. A team was sent to check traffic camera footage and discovered that Thomas's car had been seen heading towards the mountains on Friday morning. A search was organized for Sunday morning. Thomas's car was found in the Bear Creek Trail parking lot at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, exactly where he had left it. The car was locked, the keys were not inside, and there were no signs of a struggle or anything unusual. It was as if Thomas had simply parked, grabbed his backpack, and gone for a hike from which he never returned. The impact of this discovery on family and friends was devastating, because at that moment everyone remembered his words. Everyone mentally replayed those strange statements about his body being found near the mountains, and the hidden truth that no one wanted to accept began to become inescapable. Thomas had known. Somehow, through some inexplicable mechanism, he had foreseen exactly what was happening now. Thomas's decision to go to the mountains that day, to lie about being sick, to make that final call to his mother, it all began to make terrible, tragic sense. He wasn't running away impulsively. He was following a script, fulfilling a destiny he had glimpsed weeks before. It was as if that premonitory knowledge had guided his actions, inevitably, leading him to that point. If you are now feeling the weight of this revelation, the anguish of realizing that all the signs were there, but no one could prevent what happened. The official search for Thomas Brennan began that Sunday morning, October 28th. But behind the scenes, the family had been panicking since Saturday afternoon. When David called the police and mentioned Thomas's prophetic statements, there was an immediate change in protocol. What could have been treated as an adult choosing to stay out of contact for a while gained urgency. An officer asked David specifically, did he say where in the mountains? And it was at that moment that David realized something terrible. Thomas had never specified. He said, near the mountains, but the Colorado Rockies stretch for hundreds of miles. Carol and James Brennan arrived in Boulder on Saturday night, driving 3 hours from their hometown. Carol was devastated, oscillating between hope that Thomas was all right and the utter terror caused by those words he had said. She remembered perfectly the last phone call, that "I love you, Mom," that now seemed like a deliberate goodbye. James tried to remain calm, with the practical mindset of someone who needs to be strong for their family, but you could see the fear in his eyes. Jennifer arrived early Sunday morning, flying in from another city. She went straight to the Bear Creek Trail parking lot, where search and rescue teams were already organizing. The impact of seeing her brother's car there abandoned, knowing he had gone into those mountains alone, was devastating. She later recounted having to lean on David to avoid completely collapsing at that moment. The county search and rescue team initially mobilized about 20 people, including experienced volunteers, forest rangers, and 2 search dogs. They began along the Bear Creek Trail, following Thomas's last known route. The Morrison couple was located and interviewed, providing the last confirmed sighting of him. The teams worked throughout Sunday, scouring the main trail and then spreading out to secondary trails and off-trail areas. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. David remembered the photos Thomas had taken during that hike 10 days earlier, those strange images of specific rock formations and natural landmarks. He mentioned this to the search coordinators, and the police gained access to the cloud backup on Thomas's phone. When they downloaded the photos and showed them to the park rangers, some of the landmarks were recognized. They were in a specific area of the mountains, about 8 kilometers beyond where the Bear Creek Trail officially ended. It was as if Thomas had left a map, a trail of digital breadcrumbs showing exactly where he was going. This raised distressing questions. Was he consciously planning this? Or was he being guided by some force he himself didn't fully understand? The revelations that came from analyzing his cell phone painted a complex picture of someone who simultaneously seemed resigned to his fate, but was also trying to leave clues to be found. On Monday, the search expanded dramatically. Helicopters with thermal cameras were brought in. More than 50 volunteers joined the effort, many of them fellow hikers who had hiked with Thomas at some point. Ryan organized a specific group of people who knew Thomas's hiking habits, trying to think like him, to anticipate where he might have gone. The family established a base of operations at a hotel near the trailhead parking lot. Carol couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. She stayed awake all night, looking at mountain maps, as if she could somehow sense where her son was. James spent his days with the search teams, wanting to be there when they found Thomas, needing to do something useful to avoid going crazy with the feeling of helplessness. Jennifer did something that seemed strange to some, but made perfect sense to her. She asked to see the diary Thomas kept. On his cell phone, his notes and reminders, the police granted limited access, and she found something that made her heart stop. A note dated 2 weeks before the disappearance that simply read, "View from the South Peak." That's it. View from the South Peak. She immediately showed this to the search coordinators. There were several peaks in the region, but one in particular was located south of the Bear Creek Trail, a smaller peak, not very popular with tourists, but known to experienced hikers. Search teams redirected efforts to that area. It was more difficult terrain, requiring climbing equipment in some sections. The weather began to change on Tuesday, with snow forecast for the coming days, which added desperate urgency to the efforts. David couldn't stop thinking about that night at the bar, about the moment Thomas had first said those words. He blamed himself for laughing, for not taking it seriously. What if he had insisted more? What if he had forced Thomas to seek professional help? What if he had realized that it wasn't a joke but a disguised cry for help? This guilt was consuming not only David, but all the friends who had heard the prophetic pronouncements and dismissed them. Marcus organized a vigil on Wednesday night, gathering co-workers and friends. More than 100 people showed up, holding candles, sharing memories of Thomas, praying, or simply being present in solidarity. Sarah, the HR colleague who had processed the updated beneficiary documents, wept, silently, wondering if Thomas already knew at that exact moment what was about to happen. The transformation in the community was remarkable. People who had never met Thomas personally volunteered to help with the search. Local restaurants donated food to the teams. Hotels offered discounted rooms to family members and volunteers who came from afar. There was something about Thomas's story, about the prophetic nature of his disappearance, that touched people deeply. On Thursday, 5 days after the disappearance, one of the search teams found something. It wasn't Thomas, but it was evidence that someone had been there recently. Footprints that matched the size and pattern of the boots Thomas was wearing, leading towards the South Peak. The footprints stopped in a rocky area where they left no more visible marks, but the direction was clear. The family received the news with a mixture of renewed hope and terror. Carol held James's hand so tightly that it left marks. Jennifer couldn't stop trembling, because everyone knew what those footprints meant. Thomas had gone exactly where his words and notes suggested he would. The prophecy was being fulfilled with a precision that defied any rational explanation. The teams advanced in that direction, now with full climbing equipment. The terrain was treacherous, demanding slow and careful movement. Experienced rangers said that this was not an area where anyone would go by accident. You needed to want to be there. You needed to have a specific purpose for making that journey. And then on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the disappearance, they found it. If your heart is racing right now, if you realize we're reaching the most crucial moment in this story, comment below, they found him. Because what the search teams discovered on that southern peak will terrifyingly confirm that Thomas really did know. It was 9:43 a.m. when Forest Ranger Michael Chen spotted something through his binoculars. The team had been climbing for over 3 hours that Friday morning, following the trail of footprints and their intuition based on notes from Thomas's cell phone. The sky was clear, one of those cool mountain mornings where you can see for miles ahead. And that's exactly what allowed Chen to see what appeared to be a black backpack against the rocks, about 200 meters ahead in a high area near the peak. The team advanced cautiously. The protocol in situations like this is always to assume that the person may only be injured and may need immediate first aid. But the closer they got, the clearer it became that Thomas Brennan was beyond help. He was found sitting, his back against a large rock formation, looking directly at the mountains to the south. His position was almost serene, as if he had simply sat down to appreciate the view and never risen again. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because the details of where and how Thomas was found are what make this case absolutely impossible to explain through coincidence. He was approximately 8.5 kilometers from the parking lot where he had left his car. He was at an elevation of about 3,200 meters above sea level, and he was exactly in the area that corresponded to the photographs he had taken weeks before, those natural landmarks that no one understood why he was documenting. The rock formation against which he was leaning was distinctive, an irregularly shaped rock that stood out from the surrounding landscape. And when investigators later compared photos from Thomas's cell phone with the location where he was found, they discovered that he had photographed that exact rock. He had been there before, or at least knew exactly what that place would look like. The precision was uncanny. We're not talking about a general area of the mountains, but a specific point that he had somehow identified weeks before. His body was in a state of decomposition, consistent with a week of exposure to the elements, but preliminary analysis at the scene found no obvious signs of trauma. There were no visible injuries, no blood, and it didn't appear there had been a fall or accident. His backpack was beside him, still closed. Inside, teams found water, some untouched granola bars, a basic first aid kit, and a small notebook. The notebook was what sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. On the last page, written in slightly shaky but still legible handwriting, Thomas had written a message. It read, "If you are reading this, it means they found me where I said I would be. I don't understand how I knew. I didn't choose this, but I knew. Tell my family that I love them and that I'm sorry I couldn't prevent it." The message was dated October 26th in the morning, the day of his disappearance. He had written it shortly before he died. Michael Chen, the forest ranger who made the initial discovery, said in later interviews that in 20 years of service in search and rescue operations, he had never seen anything like it. The accuracy with which Thomas had predicted not only that he would die in the mountains, but the exact location where he would be found, defied all his experience and understanding. Chen was a man of science, trained to think in terms of rational cause and effect, but he admitted that this case made him question much of what he thought he knew about consciousness and premonition. The news was delivered to the family around 11 o'clock that morning. The officer in charge, an experienced man named Captain Robert Hayes, had the difficult task of informing Carol and James that their son had been found, but had not survived. Carol's reaction was one of deep sorrow, the kind of pain that comes from the depths of the soul. But mixed with the pain was something else, a terrible confirmation of what she already knew, since he said those words on the last call. Thomas wasn't just missing. He had deliberately gone to that specific place, following a knowledge that transcended any rational explanation. Jennifer asked to see the notebook, to read her brother's last words. When the officer allowed her to see a photo of the page, she broke down, because there was the final proof, written in Thomas's own hand, confirming that he was aware of what was happening, that he knew he was fulfilling a prophecy he himself had made but couldn't understand. David and the other friends received the news through calls from the family. The impact was devastating in a unique way because, along with the pain of loss, came the realization that every word Thomas had said in the previous weeks was true. He wasn't being dramatic, he wasn't seeking attention, he wasn't having a mental breakdown. He was literally seeing the future, his own future, and trying to communicate it in the only way he knew how. The authorities had to deal with something for which there was no established protocol. How do you officially document a case where the victim predicted with impossible accuracy the circumstances of their own death? The initial report classified the case as death by exposure to the elements, but there were extensive notes on the unusual circumstances, on the prophetic statements, on the precision with which Thomas had navigated to that specific point. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy, Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, determined that the cause of death was hypothermia. Thomas had simply sat there and allowed the mountain cold to take its toll. There were no drugs in his system, no alcohol, nothing to suggest he was under the influence of any substances. His organs were healthy, There were no pre-existing medical conditions that would explain what happened. He was a young, healthy man who hiked to a specific point in the mountains and chose not to return. But was it a choice? That's the question that haunts everyone who knows this story. Did Thomas have free will, or was he following a pre-written script? If he saw the future, does that mean the future was already determined? And if it was determined, what's the point of trying to change anything? These are profound philosophical questions that Thomas's case forces us to confront. The place where he was found became, in a way, a place of pilgrimage. In the following months, people who had heard the story made the journey there, leaving flowers, notes, small memorials. There was something about Thomas's journey that resonated deeply, that touched on universal fears and curiosities about destiny, premonition, and the nature of consciousness. The accuracy of his prophecy left no room for doubt or ambiguity. He said his body would be found near the mountains. It was found in the mountains. He photographed the exact location weeks before. He wrote a note confirming that he knew. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Thomas Brennan had seen his own end and, unable to avoid it, had consciously walked towards it. If you're trying to process this disturbing truth, if you're wondering how this is possible, the formal investigation into the death of Thomas Brennan was conducted by the Boulder Police Department in conjunction with the Forest Service and the County Coroner's Office. Captain Robert Hayes was the lead investigator, and he approached the case with the professional skepticism expected of someone with over 20 years of experience in criminal investigations. But even Hayes admitted in later interviews that this case challenged many of his assumptions about how the world works. A full autopsy was performed by Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, and the report was released 2 weeks after the body was discovered. The official cause of death was recorded as hypothermia. Thomas's body temperature had dropped to critical levels, causing progressive failure of vital organs. The report indicated that he likely lost consciousness gradually as his body shut down, a process that would have taken several hours considering the weather conditions that particular night. A full toxicology report found absolutely nothing in Thomas's system. No alcohol, no recreational drugs, no prescription or over-the-counter medications. This immediately ruled out any theory that he was under the influence of substances that could have impaired his judgment or caused hallucinations. He was completely sober and conscious when he made the decisions that led him to that point. The examination of the body also revealed no physical trauma. There were no injuries, no signs of struggle, no indication that he had slipped or fallen. His bones were intact. There were no significant bruises beyond some superficial scratches consistent with walking on rocky terrain. From a physical standpoint, Thomas was in good health until the moment he simply stopped and allowed the cold to do its work. Investigators meticulously analyzed the possibility of foul play. Was Thomas forced to go to that location? Was there another person involved? The forensic team examined the area around where the body was found, searching for evidence of other presences. They looked for additional footprints, signs of a struggle, any indication that Thomas was not alone on that peak. What they found was conclusive. Thomas was completely alone. The only footprints in the area were his. There were no signs that anyone else had been in that specific part of the mountain in the preceding weeks. The trail cameras that had captured Thomas on the morning of his disappearance showed no one following him. The Morrison couple who saw him on the trail confirmed that he was alone. Every piece of evidence pointed to the fact that Thomas had made that journey entirely on his own. This led the investigation to the inevitable question: was it suicide? The official classification of a death as suicide requires evidence of deliberate intent to end one's own life. And technically, Thomas had consciously walked into a hostile environment and allowed the natural consequences to occur. But there were complexities that made this classification problematic. The letter Thomas left in the notebook wasn't exactly a traditional suicide note. He didn't express despair, didn't explain why he wanted to die, didn't ask for forgiveness for causing pain to his loved ones. Instead, he wrote about not understanding how he knew what was about to happen, about not having chosen it. The language suggested someone who felt he was fulfilling an inevitable destiny, not someone who had made an active decision to end his own life. Dr. Michael Thompson, a forensic psychiatrist consulted by the investigation, analyzed all available records regarding Thomas's mental state in the preceding weeks. He reviewed text messages, conversations reported by friends and family, cell phone notes, everything. His conclusion was that Thomas did not exhibit the typical patterns of someone planning suicide. There was no progressive social isolation, no definitive emotional farewells beyond those specific, prophetic statements, and no signs of clinical depression. Dr. Thompson proposed something that sounded almost impossible to officially categorize. He suggested that Thomas may have experienced what some researchers call a self-fulfilling premonition, where knowledge of a future event creates a psychological compulsion to fulfill that vision. It wasn't exactly suicide in the traditional sense, because the primary intention wasn't to die, but rather to follow what seemed to be an inevitable destiny that had already been foreseen. The police also investigated whether there was any external reason for Thomas wanting to disappear or end his own life. They checked his finances and found no problems. He had no significant debts, was not being sued, and there were no threats against him. They spoke extensively with Claire, his ex-girlfriend, and she confirmed that the breakup had been amicable, without drama or lingering conflict. There was no identifiable reason in Thomas's life that would explain why he would do this. The investigators examined his medical history, looking for neurological conditions that could cause premonitions or altered perceptions. They consulted with neurologists about brain tumors, temporal lobe epilepsy, or other conditions that could produce experiences that appear precognitive. But Thomas had never reported neurological symptoms, nor had he ever undergone tests that indicated any brain abnormality. A team specializing in digital analysis was brought in to examine all of Thomas's electronic devices. They searched for research on suicide methods, visits to forums or websites related to death, anything that suggested planning. What they found was surprising because of the absence of anything suspicious. Thomas had researched premonitions and precognitive experiences in the weeks before his disappearance, but these were searches by someone trying to understand what was happening to him, not by someone planning something. The case was officially closed 6 months after Thomas's death. The final classification on the death certificate was death by hypothermia under undetermined circumstances. It was not classified as suicide because there was insufficient evidence of clear intent. It was not classified as an accident because Thomas had deliberately walked to that specific location. And it was definitely not a crime, as there was no evidence of third-party involvement. But this official conclusion left many people dissatisfied. Thomas's family felt that the truth was being avoided because it was too strange to fit into normal categories. David and his friends felt that the investigation had failed to truly confront the prophetic nature of Thomas's statements. How do you investigate something that transcends conventional explanations of cause and effect? Captain Hayes wrote in his personal notes on the case, which were later shared in an interview for a documentary, that the investigation had been one of the most frustrating of his career. Not because there was a lack of evidence, but because all the evidence pointed to something he lacked the vocabulary or conceptual framework to process adequately. He had all the suits, but the suits didn't form a narrative that made sense within his understanding of how the world works. If you're noticing that sometimes the truth is stranger than any explanation we try to force upon it, comment below. Some cases defy explanation, because now we need to explore the different theories that have emerged, trying to understand how Thomas knew. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when a case like this gains public attention, multiple interpretations inevitably arise, attempting to explain the inexplicable. And the interesting thing is that each theory reveals as much about the people proposing them as about the mystery itself. Let's explore the main explanations that have been offered, from the most scientific to the most speculative. The most rational theory, defended by skeptical psychologists and neuroscientists, is that Thomas was unconsciously planning his own end, and the prophetic pronouncements were manifestations of this planning disguised as premonitions. In this interpretation, he had already decided at some deep level of his mind that he would go to that specific location in the mountains, and the dreams and verbal pronouncements were simply his subconscious processing that decision. The idea is that nothing supernatural was happening, just a human mind creating a narrative of inevitability to make it easier to carry out a difficult decision. Dr. Richard Hayes, a clinical psychologist who studied the case, proposed that Thomas may have been undergoing a process of dissociation where he experienced his own plans as if they were premonitions from outside. This dissociation would have allowed him to emotionally distance himself from the decision, transforming something he was actively choosing into something he was merely predicting. It's an elegant theory that keeps everything within the bounds of known psychology, but it has problems when you consider the specific accuracy of the predictions and the absence of typical signs of suicidal ideation. There is also the theory of extreme statistical coincidence. Mathematicians argue that in a world with billions of people, some absurdly improbable coincidences will inevitably occur. Thomas may have made a vague statement about dying in the mountains because he enjoyed hiking, and then by pure chance ended up actually dying there. The obvious problem is that Thomas's predictions weren't vague. They were specific, including photographs of the exact location weeks beforehand. A more philosophical perspective comes from researchers who study premonitions and precognitive experiences. They suggest that Thomas may have experienced a genuine phenomenon of non-linear temporal perception. The idea is that under certain circumstances, particularly in moments of profound existential significance, human consciousness can occasionally perceive future events. It is not known how this would work from a physical standpoint, but there are theories involving quantum mechanics and the non-linear nature of time. Dr. Julia Santos, a parapsychologist who has dedicated her career to studying documented cases of premonition, sees Thomas's case as one of the most compelling examples ever recorded. She argues that the specificity and documentation of the predictions, combined with the absence of any reason for fraud, suggest that Thomas was indeed accessing information about his own future. There is a darker theory that some private investigators have put forward. What if Thomas was being pursued or threatened by someone, and the prophetic pronouncements were not premonitions, but rather actual knowledge of a threat? In this interpretation, Thomas knew that someone planned to kill him and throw him into the mountains. The problem is that the investigation found absolutely no evidence of threats, enemies, or anyone who had a motive, and the location where he was found was so remote that it would be a bizarre place to commit a crime. There are also spiritual and religious perspectives on the case. Some people believe that Thomas was receiving messages from a supernatural source, perhaps trying to prepare him for what was to come. Others interpret the case through the lens of fate and free will, seeing Thomas as someone who glimpsed his destiny but was unable to alter it. These interpretations offer comfort to some people, but are impossible to verify through scientific methods. One particularly interesting theory comes from neuroscientists who study altered states of consciousness. They suggest that Thomas may have had some kind of undiagnosed neurological episode that produced intensely realistic experiences that seemed like premonitions. Certain forms of temporal lobe epilepsy can produce mystical or prophetic experiences. But Thomas never reported other neurological symptoms, and there is no evidence of brain damage in the autopsy. There's also the possibility that Thomas visited that location in the mountains years before, perhaps in childhood, and the memory was buried in his subconscious. When he started having the dreams, it was actually that old memory resurfacing, but investigators checked extensively and found no evidence that Thomas had been in that specific area before. The hidden truth may be that no single theory fully explains what happened to Thomas. Perhaps it's a combination of factors, a complex phenomenon involving both psychological processes and something else we don't yet understand. The impact of the case is that it forces us to keep an open mind to possibilities we usually dismiss. What makes this case particularly significant is the quality of the documentation. We have multiple witnesses to the prophetic statements. We have dated photographs of the location. We have the note written in his own hand. This is not a case where we have to rely on vague memories. The evidence is solid and verifiable. Jennifer, Thomas's sister, has developed her own perspective in the years since his death. She believes her brother was experiencing something genuinely anomalous, something that transcended conventional psychological explanations. But she also believes Thomas was terrified by it, that he didn't want to fulfill that prophecy, but felt he had no choice. David maintains a more skeptical stance, believing there must be a psychological explanation that we simply don't yet understand. He thinks labeling the case as supernatural is giving up on seeking the true scientific explanation. But even David admits that some of the coincidences are difficult to reconcile with pure chance. What everyone agrees on is that the case defies our conventional categories. It doesn't fit neatly into suicide, accident, or crime. It doesn't fit neatly into supernatural premonition, conscious planning, or coincidence. It lives in some in-between space that forces us to acknowledge that perhaps our understanding of consciousness, time, and destiny is more limited than we'd like to admit. If you're realizing that perhaps reality is more complex than our theories can capture, the case of Thomas Brennan remains officially closed, but the questions it raises remain open and unsettling. Today, more than 4 years after that October morning when he last walked into the mountains, his story is still studied, debated, and used as an example in discussions about the limits of human consciousness and the nature of time. And what makes this case so significant is not only the specific facts of what happened to Thomas, but the philosophical and existential questions it forces us to confront. Do some people actually have the ability to foresee their own end? We're not talking about a vague sense of mortality that we all share, but specific, detailed knowledge about the circumstances of one's own death. Thomas not only sensed that something bad was going to happen, he said exactly where his body would be found, photographed the location weeks beforehand, and then consciously walked there. How do we reconcile this with our understanding of how the mind works? A deeply unsettling possibility is that the future already exists in some sense, that time is not the straight, progressive line we subjectively experience, but rather something more complex, where past, present, and future coexist simultaneously. If this is true, then under certain rare conditions, perhaps some people can occasionally perceive events that, from our linear perspective, have not yet happened. Thomas may have been one of those people, someone who caught a glimpse through the veil of time. But this raises an even more disturbing question about free will. If Thomas saw the future, does that mean the future was already predetermined? And if it was predetermined, did he have any real choice in what happened? When he walked to that mountain peak, was he exercising free will or simply following a script that had already been written? These are questions that philosophers have debated for millennia, but Thomas's case makes them viscerally real. There is something profoundly tragic in the idea that Thomas may have foreseen his own end but was unable to avoid it. Imagine carrying that knowledge, waking up every morning, knowing that at some specific point in the near future you will die in a particular way in a specific place. Would you try to change? Would you avoid mountains altogether? Or would you feel an inexplicable compulsion to fulfill what you saw? The note Thomas left in his notebook suggests he was grappling with precisely these issues. "I didn't choose this," he wrote. But then why did he go? Why didn't he stay home, surround himself with people, do everything in his power to ensure the premonition didn't come true? The answer may be that when you see the future clearly enough, perhaps the idea of avoiding it begins to seem as impossible as avoiding the past. Or perhaps we are connecting dots that don't exist. Perhaps Thomas was simply planning to end his own life for reasons he never fully communicated, and the prophetic pronouncements were merely his mind's way of processing that decision. Perhaps the coincidences, however striking they may seem, are just that, coincidences. Perhaps we are seeing mystery and meaning where there is only tragedy and chance. The impact of Thomas's case on how we think about consciousness and destiny goes beyond the academic. Families around the world who have heard this story have begun to pay closer attention when loved ones say strange things, express premonitions, or demonstrate inexplicable knowledge of future events. Thomas's story is a reminder that perhaps we should take these experiences more seriously, even when they challenge our rational understanding. The transformation that has occurred in those closest to Thomas is significant. Jennifer left her career in finance and returned to studying, now researching consciousness and anomalous experiences. She feels it is her mission to understand what happened to her brother. David has begun to question many of his certainties about how the world works, becoming more open to possibilities he would previously have dismissed. Carol, Thomas's mother, found comfort in spiritual groups that believe those who depart leave signs and messages. She sees Thomas's prophetic pronouncements not as evidence of cruel fate, but as a demonstration that there is more to existence than just the physical plane. James grapples with the loss in a more pragmatic way, focusing on keeping his son's memory alive through the foundation they established. The spot in the mountains where Thomas was found has unofficially become a place of reflection. It's not a formal memorial, but people who know the story occasionally make the difficult hike there, leaving behind small piles of stones, messages written on biodegradable paper, and wildflowers. It's as if that peak has become a liminal space where the veil between the known and the unknown seems thinner. Behind the scenes in the scientific community, Thomas's case is debated with a mixture of fascination and unease, because it challenges researchers to consider phenomena they would prefer to dismiss, but the documentation is too strong to ignore. Some see it as an opportunity to expand our understanding, others as an atypical case that should not distract from conventional work. What no one can deny is that Thomas Brennan experienced something extraordinary in the last weeks of his life. Whether this is labeled a genuine premonition, a complex psychological episode, or something entirely different, his experience was real for him. And the fact that his predictions came true with such precision means that we cannot simply dismiss the case as delusion. Thomas's journey forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge. We live in an era where we understand incredibly about the physical universe, but human consciousness, the subjective nature of experience, the possibility of non-linear temporal perception, all of this remains profoundly mysterious. And perhaps it is fitting that it remains so. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be completely solved, but rather to remind us that reality is vaster, stranger than our theories can capture. Thomas's case is an invitation to maintain intellectual humility, to recognize that there is much we still do not know. If you're leaving this story with more questions than answers, with a mixture of wonder and unease about consciousness and destiny, write in the comments, "There's more mystery than certainty," because that's exactly the appropriate conclusion for a case that defies all our assumptions. Look, if you've made it this far with me, if you've followed every detail of this impossible story from beginning to end, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's not easy to delve into cases that shake up how we understand reality, that make us question certainties we thought were unshakable. But that's exactly why this channel exists. To bring you real stories that challenge us, that make us think, that remind us that the universe is much more mysterious than we usually admit. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time. Because every week I bring you cases like Thomas Brennan's, mysteries involving premonitions, unexplained disappearances, situations where the line between the possible and the impossible becomes completely blurred. And I do this with the same respect and depth you saw here today, treating each story, each person involved, with the seriousness they deserve. And if you've truly stayed with me until the end, if this journey through Thomas's story touched you in some way, leave a comment saying, "He knew all." Along, I read every comment, every reflection you share, and often the stories you tell are as chilling as the cases I present here. This exchange is what makes all of this valuable. Click the like button too, because it shows that this type of content deserves to be seen by more people. That real mysteries and profound reflections on consciousness and destiny have an audience that isn't afraid to explore the unknown. And before you go, there's a video over here about identical dreams in different people before a mass disappearance in Arizona. Click and continue with me there, because this journey through the deepest mysteries of human existence is only just beginning. Until the next case.